Imagine being the most powerful man on the planet, sitting in the Oval Office, and realizing that when you hit the panic button, nobody answers. In 2019 and 2020, the world watched as a massive geopolitical showdown pushed the United States and Iran to the very brink of an all-out war that could have set the entire Middle East on fire. Donald Trump was calling every world leader, demanding a coalition, begging for naval support, and asking his closest allies to stand shoulder to shoulder against the Iranian threat. But one by one, the phones went silent. London said no. Paris stayed quiet. Berlin turned its back. Even countries that usually follow Washington into any fight suddenly had a massive change of heart. It was a humiliating moment of total isolation for a superpower. But why? Why did the world's strongest alliances crumble the moment Iran entered the crosshairs? Was it because they were scared of Iran? Or was it because they were scared of what Trump might do next? This is the untold story of how the maximum pressure campaign backfired so badly that the United States ended up standing completely alone on the edge of a global catastrophe. To understand why every nation rejected the call for help, we have to go back to the moment the bridge started to burn. For decades, the relationship between Washington and Tehran has been a ticking time bomb, but there was a brief moment of hope when the Iran nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, was signed. The entire world, including the UK, France, Germany, China, and Russia, breathed a sigh of relief. They thought the threat of a nuclear Iran was handled. But then, Donald Trump entered the scene. He didn't just dislike the deal, he loathed it. He called it the worst deal in history, and, in a move that shocked his allies, he tore it up. This wasn't just a policy change, it was a slap in the face to every nation that had spent years negotiating it. When Trump walked away, he didn't just leave the deal, he left the global consensus. He started a campaign called Maximum Pressure, which was essentially an economic stranglehold on Iran. He expected the world to follow him, but instead he created a vacuum of trust. The Allies felt that Trump had created a crisis where there wasn't one, and they weren't about to send their soldiers to fix a problem he had started on purpose. As the economic sanctions began to bite, Iran didn't just sit back and take it. They started pushing back in the Persian Gulf, specifically around the Strait of Hormuz. This is the world's most important oil choke point. If this closes, the global economy collapses overnight. Suddenly, tankers were being attacked, limpet mines were being attached to hulls, and drones were being shot out of the sky. This was the moment Trump thought his allies would finally snap into line. He called for the creation of a massive international maritime security force. He told the world that their oil was at risk, and they needed to provide the ships and the guns to protect it. He expected a coalition of the willing, like we saw in the Iraq War. But the response was chillingly cold. Germany was the first to explicitly say no. They argued that joining a US-led mission would make war more likely, not less. They didn't want to be part of a mission that looked like it was designed to provoke a fight. France followed suit, suggesting a separate European mission that wouldn't be under American command. It was a clear message. We want to protect the ships, but we don't want to be anywhere near Donald Trump's finger on the trigger. The tension reached a boiling point in January 2020 with the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. When that drone strike hit in Baghdad, the world held its breath. It was the most aggressive move against Iran in 40 years. Trump expected his allies to cheer and offer support for the inevitable Iranian retaliation. Instead, there was a deafening silence, followed by frantic calls for de-escalation. Even the UK, the US's most loyal special relationship partner, was caught off guard. They hadn't been warned. They felt like a junior partner being dragged into a world war without a seat at the table. This lack of communication destroyed any remaining appetite for cooperation. International leaders were terrified that Trump was acting on impulse rather than a long-term strategy. They saw a president who was willing to assassinate a top general without a plan for what happened on day 2. For nations like Japan and South Korea, who rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil, the risk was too high. They realized that if they joined Trump, they would become primary targets for Iranian missiles, and they weren't convinced that Washington would actually protect them if things got ugly. Beyond the military aspect, there was a massive legal and diplomatic wall. The United Nations was becoming a battleground where the US found itself in the minority. Trump's administration tried to trigger a snapback of sanctions at the UN, claiming that because Iran had violated the nuclear deal, all previous international sanctions should be reinstated. But there was a glaring logical flaw that the rest of the world pointed out. The US had already left the deal. You can't leave a club and then try to use the club's rules to punish someone else. It was a diplomatic disaster. In a historic vote, the UN Security Council overwhelmingly rejected the American proposal. Only one country, the Dominican Republic, voted with the United States. Think about that for a second. The most powerful nation on Earth couldn't even convince its closest European or Asian allies to vote with it on a matter of global security. This wasn't just about Iran anymore. It was a global protest against the America First policy. The world was telling Trump that if he wanted to go it alone, he would truly be alone. Another major factor was the change in how the world viewed American intelligence. The ghost of the 2003 Iraq War still haunted the halls of power in London, Paris, and Berlin. Back then, they were told there were weapons of mass destruction, and they followed the U.S. into a conflict that lasted decades and cost trillions. When the Trump administration started producing evidence of Iranian provocations, the skepticism was at an all-time high. Allies were demanding raw data, not just briefings. They were checking and double-checking every claim. They saw a pattern of the White House cherry-picking information to justify a conflict. This trust gap was a massive hurdle. Even when Iran was clearly at fault, like the shooting down of a Ukrainian passenger jet, the Allies focused on the fact that the tension had been ratcheted up by the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA. They viewed the entire conflict through the lens of a self-fulfilling prophecy. To them, Trump had predicted a conflict, created the conditions for it, and then asked everyone else to help him fight it. We also have to look at the shifting reality of energy independence. In the past, the U.S. could demand help because everyone was dependent on the same oil. But by 2019, the U.S. had become a net exporter of oil and gas. Trump's rhetoric of energy dominance actually signaled to the world that the U.S. didn't strictly need the Middle East as much as it used to. European and Asian nations realized that if a war broke out, the U.S. might be okay, but they would be the ones facing an energy crisis and skyrocketing prices. This created a massive divergence in national interests. Why would France or Japan risk their entire economy to support a U.S. policy that seemed designed to destabilize their primary energy source? The logic just didn't hold up. Furthermore, the domestic politics in these countries played a huge role. In places like Germany and the UK, the public was overwhelmingly against another Middle Eastern war. Leaders knew that if they sent troops to help Trump, they would likely be voted out of office within months. It was political suicide to align with a president who was deeply unpopular in Europe. Finally, there was the China and Russia factor. While the West was hesitating, Beijing and Moscow were moving in to fill the void. They saw Trump's isolation as a golden opportunity. Every time the U.S. pressured a country to stop buying Iranian oil or to join a naval task force, China was there offering trade deals and investment. Russia was there offering diplomatic cover at the UN. This made it much easier for smaller nations to say no to Washington. They felt they had an alternative power bloc to lean on. By the time the dust settled, the maximum pressure campaign hadn't resulted in a new deal or a regime change in Tehran. Instead, it had resulted in a more aggressive Iran, a more influential China, and a United States that realized its first policy had become an only policy. The rejection wasn't just about the Iran conflict. It was a turning point in history where the world decided that the American umbrella wasn't worth the storm that came with it.